I woke up early that morning, excited for a hike alone in the thick woods near my town. The air was cool, the sun just peeping through the dense leaves above. As I walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of cars and people faded away. The path narrowed, and the trees closed in around me, making spooky shadows on the ground. Hours passed, and I started to lose my sense of where I was. The thick bushes and trees seemed to be working against me, all the paths looking the same. Fear started to eat at me when I realized I was lost. With every step, the forest got quieter, except for the occasional sound of leaves rustling or a branch snapping far away. As the sun went down, I started walking faster, feeling more and more urgent. I found a small open area, a brief break from the suffocating forest. A faded sign was in front of me, barely visible in the dim light. It pointed to what looked like a way out, a path leading from the tangle of trees. I felt relief as I followed the sign, my legs tired but pushing forward. But just as I started to feel hopeful, a deep growl shattered the quiet. I froze, trying to figure out where it came from. Was it a predator, or another person lost like me? My heart raced as I looked into the shadows, watching for any movement. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by rustling in the bushes. Adrenaline surged through me as I sprinted down the path, gasping for breath. Suddenly, I burst into a clearing I recognized, the start of the trail, marked by an old sign welcoming hikers. Relief flooded me as I stumbled out into the open, finally free from the forest's grip. I collapsed on a bench nearby, trying to catch my breath and silently thanking whatever had guided me back. Sitting there, the last light of day painting the sky orange and gold, I realized how easily nature could swallow someone up. The forest, beautiful yet dangerous, had pushed me to my limits and left its mark on me. With a newfound respect for the wild, I promised myself to always follow the trails and signs, never underestimating the untamed world around us. And so, as darkness settled over the woods, I walked away, a survivor, humbled yet stronger from my journey through the unknown. But as I left, a chill ran down my spine. Somewhere behind me, in the depths of the forest, I could still hear that low growl echoing in the silence, a reminder that not everything lost in the woods finds its way back. It was a sunny morning when I decided to go hiking alone. The forest near my town had always called to me, and I finally had a free day to explore it. I packed my backpack with some snacks, water, and a map, and set off on the trail. The air was cool and smelled like pine. Birds chirped high above, and the trail was well-worn, showing that many hikers had been there before. As I walked, I admired the tall trees and the way the sunlight came through the leaves. It felt peaceful, and I was glad I had taken this time for myself. After a couple of hours, I reached a fork in the trail. One path went straight ahead, clearly the main route, while the other seemed less traveled, winding deeper into the forest. Feeling adventurous, I chose the latter. The farther I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the birds faded, and the thick trees closed in around me. I hiked for another hour, enjoying the quiet. Suddenly, I noticed the trail becoming narrower and harder to see. My heart started to beat a little faster as I realized I might be lost. I pulled out my map, but it seemed I had wandered off the marked path. Trying not to panic, I decided to go back and find the main trail again. As I turned to retrace my steps, I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. I stopped and listened. The forest was silent, except for the occasional creak of branches in the wind. I shook off the uneasy feeling and continued walking. But the rustling followed me, always just out of sight. My mind raced, imagining wild animals hiding in the shadows. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I walked faster, eager to find my way back before dark. The rustling grew louder, now joined by the crunch of leaves. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Fear started to creep in. I broke into a run, desperate to escape whatever was following me. My heart pounded, and my breath came in gasps. The rustling and crunching seemed to be all around me. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst through the thick bushes and stumbled onto the main trail. Relief washed over me as I saw a couple of hikers in the distance. I called up to them, and they turned, smiling and waving. I jogged over, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. They asked if I was okay, and I quickly explained that I had gotten lost. The hikers were kind and understanding. They offered to walk with me back to the parking lot. As we made our way back, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The forest was still and silent once more. Whatever had been following me was gone. When we finally reached the parking lot, the sun had set, and the sky was full of stars. I thanked the hikers and got into my car, feeling a wave of exhaustion hit me. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't until I was safely home, with my front door locked, that I allowed myself to relax. Sitting on my couch, I replayed the day in my mind. The forest had seemed so welcoming in the morning, but it had a way of changing as the day went on. I knew I had been lucky to find my way back. Later that night, as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a faint rustling outside my window. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening intently. The sound continued for a few seconds before stopping abruptly. I forced myself to look out the window, but there was nothing there, just the empty street and the shadows of the trees. Trying to shake off the unease, I crawled back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The rustling sound played over and over in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if whatever had been following me in the forest had found its way to my home. As I lay there in the dark, I realized that some things are better left unexplored, and I vowed to never hike alone again. I always liked the idea of getting away from the city. So when my friend offered me his cabin for the weekend, I was excited. The drive took longer than I thought it would, winding through dense woods. By the time I got there, it was almost dark. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by thick trees, casting long shadows as the sun went down. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, read a book, and enjoyed the silence. The quiet was a nice change from the constant noise of the city. I went to bed early, the sound of the wind in the trees helping me sleep. The next day, I decided to explore. There was a lake nearby, about a mile's walk through the woods. I packed a lunch and set off. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but I found the lake without much trouble. It was beautiful, the water clear and still, reflecting the sky above. I spent most of the day there, eating my lunch and relaxing. On my way back, I noticed something strange. The forest seemed different, as if the trees had moved while I was gone. The trail I had followed was harder to find, and I felt a growing sense of unease. I eventually made it back to the cabin, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every noise outside seemed louder. I told myself it was just animals, but I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone looking in. I barely slept. In the morning, I decided to leave. The unease had grown too strong. As I packed my things, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps, but when I looked out the window, there was no one there. I grabbed my bag and hurried to my car, my heart pounding. I started the car and drove down the narrow dirt road. The feeling of being watched followed me. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw movement among the trees. It looked like a figure, just standing there, watching. I sped up, gripping the steering wheel tightly. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a huge sense of relief. I drove straight back to the city, not stopping until I was home. I never told my friend about the strange feeling or the figure in the woods. I wasn't sure he would believe me. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to that cabin again. The feeling of being watched, the figure in the trees, it was too real to be my imagination. Weeks later, I was back in the city, trying to forget the whole thing. One night, I was walking home when I felt it again, that sense of being watched. I turned around, and there, in the shadows of the alley, I saw the same figure. It stood still, just like in the woods, watching me. I quickly walked away, my heart racing. The city felt different after that. The busy streets and loud noises couldn't drown out the sense that someone, somewhere, was watching me. I started locking my doors and windows every night, double-checking everything. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever had followed me from the cabin wasn't going to leave. And I realized, with a chilling certainty, that some things, once found, never really let you go. I always loved the idea of spending a weekend alone in a cabin. When I found one to rent deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a break from my busy life in the city. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. The cabin was small but cozy. It had a fireplace, a little kitchen, and a loft bedroom. I unpacked my things, made a quick dinner, and settled in for the night with a book. At first, the quiet was nice. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and an owl hooting in the distance. As the night went on, the quiet started to feel creepy. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder in the silence. I kept telling myself it was just the old wood settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I went to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would help. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise outside. It sounded like something heavy moving through the bushes. I got out of bed and looked out the window. In the dim moonlight, I could just make out a figure near the trees. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked like a man. I told myself it was probably just a hiker or a hunter, someone who had gotten lost. But the figure didn't move, and the longer I watched, the more scared I felt. I forced myself to go back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child. The next day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, and I started to feel a bit silly for being so scared the night before. But as I walked, I found tracks in the dirt, leading away from the cabin. They were human tracks, deep and fresh. I followed them for a while, but they veered off into a thicker part of the woods. I decided to turn back, not wanting to get lost. When I got back to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a footprint on the porch, just outside the door. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights on and a knife by my bed. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. This time, it was closer, right outside the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the window and looked out. The figure was back, standing just a few feet away. I could see him clearly now, a man with a scraggly beard and dirty clothes. He was staring right at me. I panicked, grabbing my phone to call for help. But there was no signal. I was alone. I decided to confront him, grabbing the knife and opening the door. But when I stepped outside, he was gone. I stood there, knife in hand, my breath coming in short gasps, feeling both foolish and terrified. The next morning, I packed up and left as quickly as I could. I never looked back. I reported the incident to the rental agency, but they said no one had ever had any problems there before. Maybe it was just a drifter passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. Back in the city, I tried to put the weekend behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I hear noises outside my window. When I look out, I swear I see that same figure, standing just a few feet away, staring at me. I moved to get away from him, but what if he followed me? What if he's still out there, watching and waiting? I've always loved the idea of a cabin in the woods. The thought of getting away from the city noise and spending a weekend surrounded by nature was something I often dreamed of. So, when I found a cheap rental online, I jumped at the chance. The drive up was peaceful. The trees lining the road got thicker as I got closer. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was casting long shadows, and the air was fresh and cool. The cabin had a small porch and a single rocking chair. It looked perfect. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk around the area. There was a narrow path leading into the woods, and I followed it for a while, enjoying the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. As I walked, I noticed a faint smell of smoke in the air, but I brushed it off, thinking it was probably from another cabin nearby. When I got back, it was getting dark, so I made myself some dinner and settled down with a book. The quiet was nice, and soon I felt sleepy. I decided to turn in early. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was a faint, steady tapping sound, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I sat up and listened, my heart pounding. The noise continued, steady and unchanging. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch knocking against the wall, but it was too regular for that. I got up and grabbed a flashlight. As I walked through the small living room, the tapping grew louder. I took a deep breath and opened the front door, shining the light outside. The beam of the flashlight revealed nothing unusual, just the dark outline of trees. The noise stopped all of a sudden, and an eerie silence fell over the woods. Feeling nervous, I went back inside and locked the door. I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder in the stillness of the night. Eventually, I got tired enough to fall asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to look around. In the daylight, everything seemed normal. I walked around the cabin, checking the walls, but found nothing that could explain the tapping. I shook off the uneasy feeling and decided to go for another hike to clear my head. The day passed without anything weird happening, and by the time evening came, I was feeling more relaxed. I cooked dinner, read for a bit, and then decided to call it a night. Once again, I woke up to that same tapping sound. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I grabbed the flashlight and my phone, then crept to the front door. I hesitated before opening it, bracing myself for whatever might be out there. As soon as I opened the door, the tapping stopped. The silence was almost overwhelming. I shined the flashlight around, but there was nothing. I stepped outside, feeling the cool night air. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound from the bushes nearby. My flashlight caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. I froze. It was a deer. The animal stared at me for a moment before running off into the woods. I let out a shaky breath, relieved but still on edge. I went back inside, locked the door, and decided I would leave first thing in the morning. The following morning, as I packed up my things, I felt a sense of urgency. The cabin, once a place of peace, now felt unsettling. I loaded my car and took one last look at the place before driving away. As I reached the main road, I glanced back at the cabin one more time. It stood there, quiet and calm, but I knew I wouldn't return. The woods held their secrets, and I was happy to leave them behind. I later learned that the area had a history of wildlife encounters. The rhythmic tapping? Most likely the work of a woodpecker, and the strange sounds at night could have been any number of animals. But as I lay in bed that night, back in the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, something that wasn't a deer or a bird. And then I remembered that faint smell of smoke from my first walk. I found out later that there had been a fire in those woods years ago. A fire that had taken the lives of several campers. Maybe it was just my imagination, but as I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard that steady tapping once more, coming from the window just behind my head. I've always loved hiking and the quiet of the woods. One Saturday, I decided to explore a trail I'd never been on before. It was a remote path, not often used, which suited me just fine. I parked my car at the trailhead and set off. The first few miles were easy. I enjoyed the stillness, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the bushes. As the day went on, the trees grew closer together, their branches forming a cover that blocked out the sun. Around midday, I came to a split in the trail. The map showed both paths eventually led back to the starting point, but one path seemed tougher, going deeper into the forest. Feeling adventurous, I chose the harder route. An hour in, the trail became steeper and more overgrown. I found an old, abandoned cabin. The wood was rotting, and the roof had partially caved in. Curious, I went closer. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and musty, filled with broken furniture, a rusted stove, and remnants of what might have been someone's home. I spent a few minutes looking around, then decided it was time to head back. But when I stepped outside, I saw that the weather had changed. Dark clouds gathered, and the wind picked up. I felt a drop of rain and knew I needed to hurry. The rain started pouring down, making the trail slippery. I lost my footing several times, my hands and knees becoming covered with mud. As I kept moving, I noticed something odd. The forest seemed different, unfamiliar. I tried to retrace my steps but couldn't find any familiar landmarks. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. I took out my phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. The rain kept falling, and the sky grew darker. I kept moving, hoping to find the main trail or at least some sign of people. Hours passed, and I was exhausted, soaked to the bone, and increasingly anxious. Just as despair began to set in, I saw a light in the distance. My heart leaped with hope. I stumbled towards it, emerging from the forest onto a dirt road. The light came from a small house. I knocked on the door, and an old man answered. He took one look at me and immediately offered to help. He gave me dry clothes and a warm meal, and let me use his phone to call for help. As I sat there, wrapped in a blanket, the relief washed over me. The authorities arrived soon after and drove me back to my car. But as I left the house, the old man said something that sent a chill down my spine. He mentioned that I was lucky to have found his house because, according to him, people had gone missing in those woods before. He spoke of strange noises and shadows that moved in the dark, warning me to be careful if I ever went back. I never went hiking alone without proper gear again, and I always made sure someone knew where I was going. The experience left me shaken, and the forest, once a place of peace, now held a more complex place in my heart. The old man's words stayed with me, a reminder of nature's beauty and its hidden dangers. Every time I think back to that day, I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just beyond the trees, waiting for me to make a wrong turn. I've always loved hiking. The fresh air, the quiet, and the feeling of achievement after a long walk were things I looked forward to. One summer, I decided to check out a new trail I'd heard about. It was supposed to be a bit tricky, but I felt ready for it. The start of the trail was about an hour's drive from my place, deep in a thick forest. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty. I found it strange but ignored it, excited to have the trail to myself. I started my hike early in the morning, with the sun barely coming up. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was well marked, and I made good progress. As I went deeper into the forest, the path became narrower, and the trees were thicker. I noticed that the sounds of birds and animals started to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. The only sound was my footsteps crunching on the leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing. I decided to take a break and have a snack. Sitting on a fallen log, I pulled out my water bottle and some granola bars. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked around but saw nothing. Telling myself it was just my imagination, I finished my snack and got back on the trail. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The silence was unsettling, and the trail seemed to be getting harder to follow. It wasn't long before I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in quite some time. Panic started to set in as I realized I might be lost. I tried to go back the way I came, but everything looked the same. I couldn't find any familiar landmarks. The forest seemed to be closing in on me. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. I cursed myself for not bringing a paper map. With the sun starting to set, I knew I needed to find my way back to the car before dark. I decided to keep moving in what I thought was the right direction. As the light faded, the shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed even scarier. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, my mind imagining wild animals or worse. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw a faint light in the distance. I hurried toward it, my legs burning with exhaustion. As I got closer, I realized it was a small cabin. Relief washed over me. I knocked on the door, hoping someone could help me. The door creaked open, and an older man stood there, his face lined with age but his eyes kind. He listened to my story and nodded, inviting me inside. The cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke. He gave me some water and a place to rest, assuring me that he knew the way back to the start of the trail. The next morning, the man led me through the forest. He moved easily, clearly familiar with the area. Within a couple of hours, we reached the main trail. I thanked him over and over, offering him money for his trouble, but he refused. Back at the trailhead, I looked back at the forest, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment. I had underestimated the wilderness and overestimated my own abilities. It was a hard lesson learned. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I had come to being truly lost. I vowed never to take the forest lightly again. Just before I reached the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I could see the forest in the distance, dark and unwelcoming. A shiver ran down my spine as I remembered the man's cabin. When I had thanked him that morning, I noticed something odd about the cabin. It looked old, too old, like it had been abandoned for years. The wood was rotting, the windows covered in grime. And yet, inside, it had been warm and lived in. I shook off the thought, telling myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks. But as I merged onto the highway, I couldn't help but wonder, had I been truly alone in that forest? Or had something, or someone, been watching me the whole time? The thought lingered, leaving me with a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake.